Hey, it's I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing this. Cairo?
Yeah,
How you doing tonight, man?
good. So
Awesome.
I just want to preface this. I saw a few things you were posting on Facebook, and I realized that in the context of logic, I may have misused the word valid. So I wasn't intending to refer to whether the premises led to the conclusion. I was looking at more of logically sound or correct arguments.
Uh-huh.
So I don't know
Yeah.
if that changes what you're
No,
planning to
no,
talk
no,
about.
that's fine. Fine. And
Okay.
shame on Quinn and Mike for giving away my gotcha moment there. But we can still make this work. So I myself am an atheist. Um, but I think that in order to be a well-rounded debater, or honestly just to practice my debate, I don't mind necessarily um, arguing the other side. Now, I was going to use Plantinga's modal ontological argument. And you know what? I think I might stick with it. So I'll throw it out there, and we can see how you respond. And I might stick with this argument as well as offer up some presuppositional argument as well. Do you have anything you want to say before I jump into my opening here?
No, that's fine. I've heard of the ontological argument before, but I don't think I've heard of the specific variation you're referring to. So I'll hear it.
Yeah, yeah. There's a lot of them, a lot of variations of it. Basically, going back to the Middle Ages, St. Thomas Aquinas and such. Plantinga is a professor of philosophy at Notre Dame, that a logician at Notre Dame, and here's his argument. Didn't come up with myself, but I'm borrowing it here. So P1, if God exists, he must exist necessarily. P2, either God exists necessarily or he doesn't. Conclusion, if God doesn't have necessary existence, then he necessarily doesn't. Therefore, P1, either God has necessary existence or he necessarily doesn't. P2, if God necessarily doesn't have necessary existence, then God necessarily doesn't. Conclusion, either God has necessary existence or he necessarily doesn't exist. If it is
Okay.
not the case that God necessarily doesn't exist, excuse me, it's still part of the second conclusion. It is not the case that God necessarily doesn't exist. Therefore, God has necessary existence. If God has necessary existence, then God exists. Therefore, God exists.
Okay, so as far as I can tell, the biggest issue with that argument, or the biggest part of that, is the part about necessary existence. So what is that part saying exactly?
Do you know? Okay, necessary being okay.
I know,
You're
well,
asking for
I know what necessary existence is, but what's
okay.
the argument for it?
So you're asking me to justify that either okay. So if God exists, which specific premise were you talking about?
Whichever premises lead to the premise that says God has necessary existence.
You know what? I'm gonna send you the link of what I'm using to make it easier for you. To,
Okay, yeah, that's fine.
um, but I'm sorry. One second. Well, I'm sending this to you.
Okay.
Would you like to give an opening statement or no?
I don't have anything particular I want to say. The point of this was just so that you could propose arguments and we could talk about them.
Yeah, no, that's
Beyond the scope of logic, there isn't anything that has been proposed in support of God's existence that hasn't been able to be explained scientifically. So anything that we can't currently say with absolute certainty could be explained by science, probably we will soon be able to. So people who bring up things like the teleological argument or the fine-tuning argument of the universe, that's the same kind of argument that people made in the Middle Ages when they said that life was so complex that necessarily it must have been designed. But as we saw in that case, there was a clear alternative, which was evolution. So while we might not be able to identify that alternative to other situations we can propose, it's likely that there is some alternative that is created by science, and therefore God isn't necessary in those circumstances.
Okay. So I just sent you the link to Plantinga's modal ontological argument. And I actually don't even mind if we get away from that. We can revisit it later on. But
Okay.
I did want to focus on something you said. You said that there's nothing that maybe I might be misrepresenting this. Correct me if I am. But there's nothing that science can't explain or science potentially could explain.
Anything that science hasn't been able to explain in the past, it can now explain historically. So things that currently science can't explain, likely in the future will be explainable by science.
Mm-hmm.
Saying there's no evidence that there's no evidence for things that science can't account for currently.
So everything within the scope of science.
Everything that you could use as an argument for God is within the scope of science, beyond logical arguments like the ontological argument.
Mm-hmm.
So talking about people who bring up stuff like the unmoved mover.
Yeah. Well, that's different from the ontological argument, but that's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So could you give me a definition of what science is?
I don't know if that's necessary in this case. Why do you need that?
You said that science could explain any possible, minus some sort of logic-based argument, existence for God. I just want to know, like, where do you put the stops on science?
I'm just talking about
what isn't science equipped to explain?
Well, like I said, logical things. When I'm talking about science, I don't mean the scientific method, but scientific fields such as quantum physics or special relativity or evolutionary science or geology or any of those things. And I'm saying that any arguments people have come up with that have to do with the physical world have been able to be explained by science in the past, and therefore there's no reason to conclude that they won't be explained by science in the future as they're being brought up now.
Okay, because science, by definition, deals with the natural. Would you agree with that?
Right.
God, by definition, is of the supernatural.
Yes.
So, I mean, I guess my point is that science isn't really necessarily equipped to deal with the existence of God. I mean, most arguments. So even the teleological argument, right? Science doesn't have anything to say about the teleological argument.
It does have this. It does have something to say about the argument with respect to people who make claims about the probability of certain universes existing. So when you're talking about things like, for example, the way that gravity exists, and people who say if gravity had existed a different way, then the universe wouldn't have come into being, and therefore God must have existed in order to fine-tune those sorts of things in a way that the universe would exist such that it would sustain life. But we later discovered through special relativity that gravity was a necessary factor that came out of other forces that were explained by science, or not forces, but factors or just facts explainable by science. So anyone who uses the premise of the natural world in order to explain the supernatural, or tries to use the natural to prove that the supernatural exists, those are the claims that science is able to address.
I think that's a pretty good response. But I think the theist would come back and say that God himself was the designer of whatever factors that make gravity a necessity.
Right. So the point of that is to say that people who make that kind of argument, that's the same argument that people have made over the years. And there's no evidence of a stopping point at which we say, okay, here's the law of physics where if we made it different, then the universe wouldn't have existed and therefore God exists. But first of all, obviously, we don't know exactly what would have happened with different laws of physics. But once we get down to the very fundamental level, we don't know what's going to end up happening there. So it could be that the laws of physics simply have to be the way they are now in order to be consistent. And if they were a different way, they would have to be different in such a way that life would still be sustainable in whatever universe were created with them. So people who say things like, if the expansion rate of the universe were changed by 1 in 10 to the 55, then the universe wouldn't have existed as we know it. And it's like, yes, but there's no reason to believe that the expansion rate of the universe could have been different by a factor of 1 in 10 to the 55, because no one's ever addressed that.
No, I think that's pretty good, man. Are you a student?
Yeah, I'm in high school. I'm on my debate.
High school. Okay. Oh no, that's fantastic. You got a pretty good. I think you got a pretty good grasp, definitely for a high schooler, on the on what you're talking about.
Thank you.
And that's the funny thing is, most arguments for God are basically the same versions of arguments that have been made for a really, really long time. Honestly, the newest argument for God is the presuppositional argument, which isn't necessarily even an argument, but most of the classical or evidentiary arguments for God, you can trace back to Aquinas and to Aristotle. Again, they don't really come up with too many new things. But I also think that you're sort of missing engaging with the premise here.
Okay.
The universe exists in a certain way. That allows for life. Because there is a discernible design, there must be a discernible designer.
Well, that's a premise that you can make, but it's unsubstantiated within that argument. So you'd have to have a separate argument about why design must mean a designer, because it's the same argument as the watchmaker argument. You can say, oh, humans' eyes were intelligently designed to see, therefore there must have been a designer. And it's like, yes, it was designed, but that doesn't mean it was designed by God. In that case, it was designed by natural selection. So just because something was designed doesn't mean that there had to be some supernatural designer that exists outside of the entire universe.
That's good, man. That's good. All right, so let's talk some presuppositions, though.
Okay.
How do you know that you exist?
I think, therefore I am.
Okay, all right, but that begs the question, no?
Why? Because I use the pronoun I?
Yeah, an unexplained I.
Okay. That I've heard that argument before, and I think the problem with it is that if we can't use the word I, then we can't refer to ourselves. And you can say referring to ourselves means that we necessarily exist. But if you want me to use like really circumlocutive language to kind of dance around the word I, but not necessarily include my existence, I can do that as well. So the thing,
you don't have to.
Okay.
Yeah, I've seen the versions that do just that. And okay, so how do you know that your cognitive faculties allow you to access reality in a meaningful way? If you are just the sum product of neurons firing, electrons doing their thing, being excited in your brain, if all there is to you is the material, then how do you know that you are not mistaken?
That's an interesting argument, and it's funny because that's also one that a lot of people who believe in libertarian free will bring up. Is if you don't have free will, then how can you know that you're rational in your thought? And I think the problem with that is that it doesn't support either side, because if it's not possible for us to be correct in our thought, then we can't just assume that God exists and then use that premise to support the fact that we have rational thought. So under my worldview, there is no way to accurately know whether I can think rationally, but that doesn't mean that we need God to fix the problem.
But you're borrowing from the Christian worldview. The Christian worldview is the only one that accounts for uniformity of the universe, the only one that can account for logic. I think Mike's watching. He debated one such person today.
What do you mean it's the only one that can account for logic?
The Christian worldview is the only worldview that can account for logic. When you make a statement based on logic, you're actually barring against the Christian worldview. Also, you know that God exists, and you just are denying his existence because you like to sin.
I'm gonna sidestep the part about liking to sin. So I'll talk about the part that Christian worldview is like the only one that can use logic. So I think the problem with this is that there can exist logic in an atheistic worldview. You just can't know with complete certainty that that's correct. And if you have some kind of argument that shows that without knowing for certain that God exists, we can somehow prove that the Christian worldview is correct, then we can look at that. But if you can't prove the Christian worldview is correct, then you can't prove that logic is correct in any way. But what we do know is that when we use logic, it's useful in order to determine whether things are true. And that's why mathematics exists to serve us in the way it does, and technology works the way it does. So given that logic is useful, it doesn't necessarily matter whether it's actually true. So in either situation, logic exists and serves the human race.
To prove that God exists or to show evidence that God exists is actually sinful. I only can proclaim the existence of God. As soon as I offer evidence for the existence of God, I'm saying that God is subservient to the human intellect, or God is discernible by the human intellect. But that's not the case. It says in the Bible that I only need to proclaim his existence. Now, my worldview is in fact the only worldview that can account for logic, for the uniformity of nature, the laws of nature, so on and so forth. And I know this to be true because the opposite is impossible. And you just like to sin.
So the part about if you go against God, then it's sinful. It's not sinful if God doesn't exist. So that argument is, as the term implies, presuppositional. So you're assuming God exists, and from that conclusion, you're deriving that it would be sinful to go against him. The part about logic, you kind of restated what you said before, but you still haven't really substantiated why a world without complete certainty that logic is correct wouldn't function the way it does right now. Like, why is it impossible for logic to not be right?
It's impossible. Okay. So what I'm trying to say is that your worldview, you have no basis for even having this debate. You have no foundation for which to have any knowledge from. The only way that anyone can have knowledge is to either have absolute knowledge or to have revelation from someone that has absolute knowledge. In the Bible, it says that everyone has had, in fact, that revelation. So even by you using your logic in your faculties and your rational mind, you're actually borrowing from the Christian worldview. And you're only denying it because you like to sin.
So you're saying that, hold on. So you're saying you can't have, hold on. I don't know how I just forgot everything you said.
It's okay. It happens. Trust me, it happens to me. I can, I'll try to restate it as best I can.
Yeah, can you repeat that?
Yeah. The only way for anyone to have knowledge or for someone to have knowledge is to either have absolute knowledge or revelation from someone that has absolute knowledge. You've had that. Okay. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
So the way that we can kind of get around that is that our faculties of logic and reason evolved for a certain purpose. And as far as we can tell, that purpose is in order to describe reality accurately. Because if we can't accurately describe reality, then we wouldn't be able to survive because we wouldn't know what was going on around us. And therefore, we wouldn't be able to act in accordance to what exists. So we wouldn't do things that made sense, and then we would die. So our brains have evolved in order to be logically correct, which means that our logic is most likely reliable in most circumstances. And no, we don't have absolute knowledge. So it's true that this debate won't give us absolute knowledge of whether something exists, but it will give us a view of the world that is closer to being true or more logically founded than it otherwise would be. And that is helpful because it means that we advance our capacity for logic and reason, which can be used in real life. Like I said, talking about evolution, in order to understand the world better and be able to act in the world better. So even if you accept that absolute knowledge is impossible, debate is not a futile task because it advances our mental capabilities necessarily.
You just egregiously begged the question. You are using your faculties to justify the use of your faculties. If that wasn't circular logic, then I don't know what is, oh lover of sin. Furthermore, you cannot account for base reality actually being base reality.
You mean we're living in The Sims?
We could be. In your worldview, we could be.
Yeah, there's no argument against that as far as I can tell, besides that consciousness can't be simulated, although there's no evidence of that either. But whether or not we live in base reality also doesn't have any bearing on this debate. You could say that if we were in a simulation, then the simulator would be God. But that's a completely separate argument than whether logic is true. So you said that in me using my faculties in order to justify that they're correct is wrong. And the problem with this is that we use our faculties for everything. So you say that you have absolute knowledge from the Bible or from God, but the only way you can access that knowledge is through your faculties. You can't just absorb the Bible and somehow be granted its truths. You have to observe it through faculties. So under your worldview, you don't even know whether your reading of the Bible is correct. So it's impossible for you to have absolute knowledge as well. So you can't know that God exists either.
It's not through the reading of the Bible. It's through divine revelation that we've.
So you saw God?
No, we've received divine revelation.
Okay, but how do you know about that divine revelation?
Because it was revealed to me. God has impressed upon our hearts that He exists. He's impressed upon your heart, upon my heart. He's impressed upon an Amazonian tribe in which no contact was made with the civilized world. Has received this revelation, and we've received revelation of moral laws.
So did He like tattoo it on our chests, or like how is it imprinted on everyone's heart?
It's in your sort of your below rational mind, I guess we could say. You just
So
know it's
in your subconscious thoughts, you know that it's true.
Don't ask me where it is. You know that it's true.
This seems more like an appeal to emotion than an actual argument.
I wouldn't say it's necessarily an appeal to emotion. I think I'm just I might be asserting something without a solid foundation. I'm not sure if it's an appeal to emotion.
I'm trying to figure out how I still don't understand how you are able to know this revelation, because whether you subconsciously think that something's true doesn't necessarily dictate its truthfulness. For example, you can look at an optical illusion and think that something's moving when it's not. So that's your subconscious mind acting, but that doesn't mean that it's true. So you can't say I feel subconsciously that God exists and therefore He does. So you had to have gained that knowledge in some other way, which would necessarily be through your faculties as you've described them, which means that you can't have absolute knowledge of the revelations that you describe.
But I do, because the opposite is impossible.
Okay, we already went over that though.
Well, I don't really want to play this game anymore, but okay. Have you ever argued a presuppositionalist?
No, I haven't.
Okay, look up Psi 10 versus Matt Delahunty if you want to see an example of a presuppositional apologist at work. Because, well, first off, I admittedly I did a really poor job of representing their argument.
Okay.
They're far more articulate with what they say. And they probably have like some ready canned answers to the questions that you asked that I don't necessarily know.
What is it? How do you spell psychen?
SYE
Okay.
space 10 versus Matt
All
Delahunty.
right.
Did you find it?
Yeah, I found it.
Yeah, say put that in your YouTube videos to watch list. And I gotta warn you, like, yeah, it's probably one of the most frustrating things you could that you could come up with. Like that video is it's terrible in all the most fantastic ways. All right, let me think here. Let me
yeah, since we have 20 minutes left, where did you put the ontological argument link?
In your Facebook messages.
Okay. Let me see if I can find it.
Yeah, let me look up this a formal definition of necessary in modal logic.
Okay.
I'm sure this is super boring for anybody that's watching. I think that's what happens when you try to like debate things that you don't believe in. I don't know. I don't really care that much if I don't do a good job, honestly. But that's all right. I can keep trying.
Can you put the link in the comments to this debate, because I can't find it on my messenger.
Yeah.
I've seen some really fancy modal logic things on God's existence, but they were too long for me to understand because I don't actually have any experience with modal logic.
Yeah.
But I've seen stuff about like maximally great beings. I've seen William Lane Craig's video on ontological argument, but I think his is stupid. So,
and I mean, they all sort of followed the same vein, tried to define God into existence.
Yeah.
Instead of like showing warrant, or showing some actual evidence. But how do you explain the fact that all the apostles, I mean, they all got like eaten by lions and beheaded and crucified upside down and shit, and none of them, they didn't deny the existence of God. That onto itself, or specifically the Christian God, that onto itself lends credence to the idea of a Christian God, does it not?
So because those people believed in God, they were right?
Yes, because those people saw Jesus.
Yeah.
As is described in the Bible, and then went to their deaths in a violent way. I mean, that lends warrant, does it not?
Well, I would argue that ISIS has also gone to their deaths in a violent way, but Islam and Christianity can't be correct simultaneously. So if you accept that argument, then both Islam and Christianity are true, which is a contradiction. So it can't be correct.
But the difference between an ISIS suicide bomber is that they did not directly see the risen Christ and claim to have directly seen the risen Christ. They're brainwashed. They're in an occult. These guys, the reason that they went to death and what they proclaimed to the point of death is that they saw Jesus after he died, which was in fact what happened.
So are you saying that Jesus was resurrected?
Yes.
Okay. I don't have too much knowledge about exactly how that happened, or like I haven't read the Bible or anything. But my first response would be that a historical account of what has happened in the past is not necessarily completely accurate, and the Bible wasn't written directly after these events occurred. So one possibility would be that it was written by someone with a vested interest in God's existence. Another one would be that the apostles could have come together and decided that they saw Jesus be resurrected. I'm probably not gonna go with they all had a mass delusion, but there are a lot of ways that they could have thought they saw Jesus being resurrected when they didn't really, especially if they'd been disciples of Jesus for many years before his death. So a historical account of those events doesn't necessarily prove its existence. And the other problem with that is when you have evidence from 2,000 years ago and God hasn't shown his face since, you have to have some really strong argument about why he hasn't done that for so long. After all of our scientific verification methods have come into existence, suddenly God is nowhere to be found. So why is that?
Well, Jesus actually talked about that in the Bible, that after after his time, there'd be no more direct revelation. But as for the prophets, or excuse me, the apostles' deaths, that's not in the Bible. That actually comes from it actually comes from secular sources and from pagan sources. We know Roman accounts of how these guys died, and we have access to those sort of records and such. So how do you explain that fact?
I'm looking it up right now. So
you're looking up how to respond to my inquiry?
No, I'm looking up the apostles seeing Jesus be resurrected, or saw him after his death. So did they tell someone that they saw Jesus be resurrected? Is that, or are there secular sources saying that they died for Jesus?
Yes, they told a whole bunch of people that Jesus was resurrected, and they went out and they tried to start up the new church. This is the sort of going back to the early days of Christianity.
Yeah.
Paul was probably like the smartest one, or at least the one that's most I don't know, that offered up, I would say, probably the most compelling arguments, the arguments that swayed the most amount of people. So the claim was that they saw Jesus get resurrected, and then they go out and they go to different geographical regions to proclaim his message, and a whole bunch of them were executed by the Romans for saying things that they did, and often violently.
So I'm actually not educated on this. So did Jesus claim to be the Son of God?
According to the Bible.
Okay, but I mean, like, did he say at some point, like, I am the Son of God, or I am God, or something like that?
I don't know the exact phrasing that he used, but I want to say yes.
Okay, so if that's true, then Christianity without the apostles has already made a claim that a person has like a divine revelation or supernatural powers. So the fact that that's happened once already, if the apostles decided to come together and continue Jesus's legacy, either because they believed that he was correct or because they wanted power or for some other reason, they could easily have all decided to see Jesus' resurrection and then continue their lives as if they had done that in order to perpetuate the religion without actually having a revelation of him. And the other thing is, there are many people who will tell you that they've seen things that don't make sense. Like my grandpa told me that he saw God, but obviously that's not true. So when you have a vested interest from the beginning to make something true, So, for example, if you want Jesus to be resurrected, or you want him to still be alive because you believe that he's the Son of God and you worship him, then that makes you much more likely to see that happening, or to see some kind of possibility of it and immediately assume that that's what happens. So each of the apostles could have gone through that kind of situation. Or, like I said, they could have come together and collectively decided that they saw Jesus be resurrected.
But if they come together in some sort of conspiracy, which I believe is what you're alleging, they come together and they decide, that wouldn't explain why they were tortured and killed, and yet still, to the man, refused to deny the existence of Jesus. So actually, you said that you wouldn't argue for, you wouldn't make the argument of the mass delusion. I'm actually myself, I'm actually not afraid to make that argument, because I think that well, you can empirically demonstrate where mass delusions have happened, especially in people that have a heightened emotional state, and a close association with one another. If we're really good friends, that actually is my go-to response when I'm faced with this line of reasoning, is that it more than likely was a mass delusion, and they genuinely did believe that they saw Jesus, but that doesn't make it so. 12 dudes in the Middle East is not, their personal testimony is not convincing enough evidence for me. For a lot of reasons. I don't like the conspiracy argument, because I do think it has problems explaining how they all found the courage to the man to be tortured and die and not give up Jesus.
I think when I said mass delusion, what I meant was, I don't think that they walked outside and actually saw the figure of Jesus standing in front of them, like flesh and blood, and they actually thought that he was there. Although, is that the argument you're making, or you do?
I think that as you described it is within the realm of possibility. Okay,
because I would say that it could be more like the presuppositional argument that you were making earlier, of they somehow feel that it has happened without actually like seeing him.
Well, I think that presupposition is part of the reason why they might have had that experience, right? They're really expecting it to happen. So then something happens, and that leads them to that conclusion. I mean, honestly, I'm not even necessarily scared to make the argument that Jesus could have had a twin. And they could have seen his twin. Even to me, that is more plausible than just accepting their account at face value. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And where you can not violate Occam's razor, I think you shouldn't, right?
Yeah. And for the part where people say that he was tortured and killed, Jesus was tortured and killed as well. So he believed that he was the Son of God, but that doesn't make it true either.
So I'm gonna throw one more argument at you in these 6 minutes.
Okay.
How do you account for morality?
Okay, this is a good one. I don't think objective morality exists.
So I actually don't think that even God means that there's necessary that there is objective morality.
If there's a Christian God, then would you say even with a Christian God that's not necessary?
Even with a Christian God, that doesn't make objective morality so. And I gotta define the word objective here. A statement being true, independent of any reasoning agent, any particular reasoning agent. And if you're the Euthyphro paradox,
no,
it's a good one to Google for you, and it kind of shows why
Oh,
God doesn't.
is it the one that says like, is something moral because God says it is, or was it moral before?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I've heard of
Uh,
that.
yeah. And I mean, they have ways to, I guess, to rescue the objective morality case, that morality is an aspect of God. And, uh, part of God is God himself.
Mhm.
But I still don't think that necessarily makes it objective reality. I think it saves it from part of the criticisms of the youthful paradox, but not all of the criticisms of the youthful paradox. But if you can't, if there is no objective morality, um, why does morality matter at all?
Yeah. So first of all, the reason that I don't bring up the argument of like Christians can't explain morality either is because I don't think it's particularly relevant to this. But what I'll say to like, how do you explain morality? I can go in like a really long monologue, but basically, we don't currently know whether or not objective morality exists because as humans, we have limited basis of logic and rational thought. So we don't have the ability to 100% accurately assess anything. So in the future, it may be discoverable whether or not objective morality exists. And if there's even the slightest chance that it does, then we should be waiting for someone to come to that correct conclusion. Because if objective morality doesn't exist, then nothing matters anyway. But if it does exist, then it would be better to exist as if there was objective morality. So it's kind of a Pascal's wager argument saying regardless of whether it's true, we should act as if it exists because it doesn't matter otherwise. And then the other argument you can make is, well, people like to be happy. So if you accept that as an axiom, then you can develop your morality around that. So if you say, well, how do you know being happy is good? Well, once you get to that point, then there's no reason to believe anything. Because the whole reason people say objective morality has to exist is because otherwise people would live in a state of despair. And it's like, well, why is a state of despair bad? You're starting from the axiom that being happy is good. So if we can jointly accept that, then morality develops regardless of whether God exists.
So you can accept it as an axiom, but it still runs afoul of the is ought problem. Trying to tie happiness to morality is pretty. I would say not a great place to argue from, or at least. So I take this in a different way. I so I mean, I like your sort of you're phrasing it like Pascal's wager. I think that's pretty good. But when we talk about morality, we really only need to explain what is, right? What does morality account for in the empirical world? I think that in the long arc of evolutionary history, some certain behaviors will maximize our ability to propagate as a species.
So are you making the claim that morality is what allows us to propagate, or what do you mean by that?
Yeah, I think morality, pretty much that. Yeah, I think morality was or is a certain set of behaviors that best. Now, that's not to say that that is what is good. That's just explaining what necessitates morality. Now,
So
extrapolating that into the future is difficult, but that's not what I'm trying to do.
I think my issue with that is that you're saying that morality doesn't address what is good, and in doing that, you've kind of sidestepped the question of whether morality exists at all.
Okay, well, I'm so the existence of morality. All right, so I think that a moral claim, murder is wrong, is not a propositional claim. It's not a claim that carries truth value. I think that, so if you're asking me the source of morality, I think that we as humans have an emotional response to murder. We, in the same way that you emit an emotional response when you stub your toe. Your toe stubs, you say ow. Murder is wrong is functionally equivalent to saying murder, boo. It's not necessarily a cognitive claim in the same way that something difficult would be. But hey, anyway, You're pretty smart. Go debate a real theist on Call Out. I think you do well. Look